Thank you.
Hey, hello, I'm Todd Lefko, and I'm chairperson of the Russian American Business and Culture Council. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, Zerkalo, the Russian Press, the Museum of Russian Art, and Global Minnesota. One of the major issues facing us today is the conflict, or the potential conflict, on the Russian-Ukrainian border and the relationships in that section of the world, which could turn into a very hot spot at this moment. We're very honored to have with us an outstanding panel. Olga Pelova, unfortunately, about 5 hours ago, mentioned that there was an emergency in the family and couldn't be with us today. But we have an outstanding panel that Tom Hansen will provide. If it's possible for everyone to mute themselves at this moment. Right now, if you have, I'm honored truly to introduce not just a good friend, but one of the best minds, I think, in foreign relations in Minnesota and probably in the United States right now, Tom Hansen, who, thank goodness, retired from the diplomatic service and thankfully came back home to Minnesota, which we're very thrilled about. So Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. We're meeting today on Ukraine at a time when the Ukraine situation is in an acute phase. I think that's possible to say. So I think the insights that will be offered to us by the panel today will be very interesting and important as we try to figure out what the next steps are in this Russia-Ukraine crisis. So we are very honored to have with us today Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, one of our top diplomats. He was our ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. He served at our embassy in Moscow, is a real expert on arms control, has written a book with Michael O'Hanlon on next steps in reducing nuclear arms, also has written a book about Ukraine, The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in a Turbulent Times, which is an excellent introduction to Ukraine. Steve is non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and also is affiliated with Stanford University now. So Steve, we're so happy to have you here to kind of give us an oversight, some insights into the current situation. We also have Dr. Alexander Komorenko, who is an associate professor at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev, who will present his views on the situation now in Ukraine and the surrounding crisis. Alex is a two-time Fulbright scholar, once at Stanford University, where Steve is now, and also in Minnesota at Hamline University. So Alexander, thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much. Just a reminder, if you want to pose questions, we'll have a Q&A session after the presentations of our two panelists. Just use the chat function and send a question to everyone. I will pick up those questions and direct them to the panelists in the last phase of our conversation. We have an hour today until 2 o'clock. So without any further ado, I'm honored, very honored, to turn things over to a colleague and a friend, Steve Pfeiffer, who will discuss what's happening right now in the Ukraine situation. Steve?
Okay, well, Tom, thanks very much. Tom, I remember the interesting times we had at the embassy in Moscow together, where you had relations between Reagan and Gorbachev moving in a very positive direction. And at the same time, we were busy expelling each other in great numbers, and the Russians reduced their staff. And Tom's famous observation, probably made 2 or 3 times a month, was things are still shaking down. Anyway, we're now 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine regaining its independence. And Ukraine today is really grappling with 2 big challenges. One is the challenge that was latent but really broke into the open in 2014, and that is the Russian war against Ukraine. And the second one is really the challenge of getting Ukraine right, dealing with corruption, finishing the needed reforms to really get a competitive economy growing and allow Ukraine to realize its full potential. And Ukraine's other challenges, it has to solve both of these problems in order to be successful. So let me focus the bulk of my comments on that first challenge, which is the Russian war against Ukraine. That's now in year 8. It's usually a low intensity war. I refer to it as a simmering conflict. It is by no means frozen, but it's still very real. More than 13,000 people have died since Russia provoked and supported what it was originally seen as a separatist conflict in Donbass, but I think it's now understood that the forces fighting in Donbass are Russian and Russian proxy forces. And more than 13,000 people have died despite efforts by the Germans and the French to mediate a solution. Efforts, for example, in 2015 with the Minsk II agreement, which was designed to lay out a path to resolve the conflict. But the first 3 points of the conflict, or the first 3 points of the agreement, were never realized, the security points. They called for a full ceasefire, which has never really happened. They called for withdrawal of heavy weapons away from the line of contact. That also hasn't happened. And they called for free access for monitors from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe throughout the area. And that's always been a problem. And then beyond that, you then get to the political conditions. I think it's hard until you get the basic ceasefire points in place to talk about political conditions. But then the political points in the Minsk II agreement were also ambiguous with regards to questions such as timing and their details. So, for example, one point calls for a special status for Donbass. The Russian, I think, view is that special status should allow Donbass the ability to veto national policies, say defense policy, foreign policy, and Kyiv is unlikely to accept that. So there's lots of real questions here. Well, let me talk a bit about what I think Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin want. Ideally, they would like to see Ukraine back in Moscow's sphere of influence. The phrase that was used by Dmitry Medvedev when he was president was a Russian sphere of privileged interests. They want a Ukraine that's open to Russian business, and they want a say over major geopolitical decisions that would be taken in Kyiv. And that would certainly include Ukraine's relationship with the European Union and Ukraine's relationship with NATO. Now, some speculate, or some think that Vladimir Putin wants even more. One idea is that he might even want to reunite Ukraine with Russia, and that this might be something that Putin sees as a legacy issue. And you go back to July, where he wrote this lengthy essay on Ukraine, which basically comes close to denying Ukraine legitimacy as a sovereign state. And I think this is one of the factors that has fueled the current concern about a possible open conflict between Russia and Ukraine. You have now reports of as many as 100,000 Russian troops either on or near Ukraine's borders. And that's similar to the situation we had last April. Although in April, of course, nothing happened. But I think today, Ukraine-Russia relations are worse than they were in April. You had the Putin essay on Ukraine. You had Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, now a deputy head of the Russian Security Council, saying it was pointless to negotiate with the current authorities in Kyiv. And there is some speculation that Putin is concerned that Ukraine is irretrievably slipping away from Russia. Now, the comments and the rhetoric and Russian actions, this Russian buildup, are reasons for concern. But if I had to bet, I think the actual odds of a Russian invasion are not that high, because the cost for Moscow would be heavy. One would be an even greater degree of political isolation. The second would be tougher economic and individual sanctions. And there are already reports that the United States and the European Union have begun working up the list of the kinds of sanctions that would apply if there were Russian military incursion into Ukraine. A third cost would be, I think, a boost to rejuvenating NATO, including NATO members even further increasing their defense budgets, given concerns about Russian actions. But also the biggest potential cost for Moscow is dead Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian army today is much better than it was in 2014. I think in a conflict with Russia, it's hard to see how the Ukrainians would win, but they would certainly extract a price. And I believe that Mr. Putin has to ask himself, how does Russian soldiers coming home in body bags, how does that play with his domestic constituency, particularly when he tells them that we're all one people? And so, you can look at a win, but I go back to a comment a Ukrainian made maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and he says, well, the Russians say they could be in Kyiv in 2 weeks' time. He says, maybe they could. He said, they'd have a much harder time getting out. So I suspect what we're seeing now is another Russian effort to rattle Ukraine and also to unnerve the West. And we've seen these kinds of scares in the last 6 or 7 years. So for example, in 2015, the concern was, would Russian proxy forces move out of occupied Donbass to take Mariupol on the Sea of Azov? Mariupol makes sense as a port to export the heavy industry products of Donetsk and Luhansk. And that didn't happen. In 2020, the concern was that the Russian military might move to seize the water canal that brings, or used to bring, water from the Dnieper River down into Crimea, and the Ukrainians have closed that canal. And that also didn't happen. And I think in both cases, it didn't happen because the Russians made a calculation of costs and benefits and concluded that the costs would be too high. And I think if the Kremlin does that kind of calculation now, they're going to see that the costs don't justify whatever benefits. Now, having said that, let me say that's my logic, sitting here in California, watching Moscow. And I have always not been the best predictor of Putin's logic. He has his own logic. So I think, regardless of what odds we put on a Russian invasion, it makes sense for the West to be acting as if that is a real possibility and to be doing everything it can now to dissuade the Kremlin from that course. And that means by emphasizing political support for Ukraine. It means emphasizing to Moscow the costs. And I would suggest it would be useful if the United States and the European Union could come up with a new tough list of sanctions to privately communicate that to the Kremlin so that the Russians understand the sorts of economic costs that they would incur. I think it's useful for the West to be providing certain kinds of defensive weapons to Ukraine. And again, that sends a political message as well as helps the Ukrainian military fill some of their niche requirements. Now, at the same time, I think it's also important for the United States to be talking very candidly to Kyiv so that Kyiv understands, what the limits are on Western support. We don't want Ukraine to make a policy decision that could be turned out to be mistaken because it assumes that there might be more Western support than would be the case. And specifically, I don't see a possibility of NATO military forces fighting for Ukraine. And so I think that limit has to be clear. But it seems to me that short of a full military occupation, Russia is not likely to get Ukraine back. And I would argue that no one has done more than Vladimir Putin to build a strong sense of Ukrainian national identity. I remember talking to a Ukrainian back in 2014, and he said, Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed. And that is, he's created this strong sense of Ukrainian national identity and has imbued it with a strong anti-Russian feeling. And I think this is actually a strategic failure for Putin and the Kremlin, because nothing has done more than that policy to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. And I'll just cite my own experience. When I served in Kyiv at the end of the 1990s, there were in Western Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalists who were fairly hostile towards Russia. But for the bulk of the country, they were either well-disposed towards Russians or ambivalent. And I think that's changed. I think there now is a large segment of the Russian population, a large segment of the Ukrainian population that is hostile towards the Russian government in a way that would take years, if not decades, to overcome. And it's difficult, for example, to see a Ukrainian political leader now saying he would like to return back to Russia's orbit and then being able to survive politically. And polls show this. You've long seen Ukrainian polls showing people favoring joining the European Union, given the economic attraction of the EU. But you now see polls that regularly show pluralities, if not majorities, favoring joining NATO, as they see that as the best protection for Ukraine. So if the Kremlin understands it is not going to be able to bring back Ukraine, certainly not in the near term, what is the Kremlin trying to accomplish? And I think the conflict that you see ongoing in Donbass is designed to destabilize, distract the government in Kyiv, and to make it harder for that government to do what it needs to do to build a successful Ukraine. And it does appear that there's a difference between how the Russian government looks at Crimea. Clearly, the Kremlin wanted Crimea, but Russians have not moved in the same with regards to Donbass. And it seems that the Kremlin sees Donbass as a mechanism to put pressure on Kyiv. I think there are reasons why the Russians do not want to take Donbass. First of all, rehabilitation would be very expensive. You've got to restore infrastructure, industry, and housing. Moreover, more than 1.5 million people have left Donbass since 2014. And the population that largely remains is heavily weighted towards retirees. It's not a particularly productive population in economic terms. So it seems to me that the Kremlin right now, they might be prepared to do something about Donbass in the long term, but right now it's a mechanism to put pressure on the government in Kyiv and to make it difficult for that government to reform and draw closer to Europe. And part of this reason reflects, I believe, that the Kremlin does not want a successful Ukraine on its border. And there are two reasons. One is geopolitical, is that a successful Ukraine, and by success here, I mean a Ukraine that not only is thickening the institutions of democracy, but is also getting the economic situation right. It's dealing with corruption. It's reducing the influence of the oligarchs. And so that you have a growing economy, so it's successful in both economic and democratic terms. The Russians don't like that prospect geopolitically because that kind of Ukraine is going to be seen as a more attractive partner to the West. But I believe as important for the Kremlin and for Mr. Putin is the domestic political concern, which is if there's a successful Ukraine, successful both in economic and democratic terms, then you're going to have Russians saying, why can't we have the same political voice that Ukrainians have? Why can't we have elections that matter? Why can't we have a political situation in which civil society organizations can function in a real way? And so I think when you look at the Russian approach towards Ukraine, certainly it's partly about geopolitics, but a large part of it is about Russian domestic politics and even regime survival. I mean, that's job number one for the Kremlin. And I think there's an additional problem here which complicates Russian policy towards Ukraine, which is I'm not sure if people, particularly Vladimir Putin, but people in the Kremlin, if they understand Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I go back to a conversation maybe 10 or 12 years ago I had in Moscow with a former Soviet, senior Soviet official, but still fairly plugged in. And I asked him, does anybody in the Kremlin understand Ukraine? And he thought for a moment, he goes, yes, there's one person who understands Ukraine very well. And then he paused and he said, but nobody listens to him. And that seems to me to be evident in Russian policy. Vladimir Putin's last visit to Kyiv was back in 2013. He traveled there to mark the 1025th anniversary of Kievan Rus's acceptance of Christianity, which had big implications for religion both in Russia and Ukraine. But he gave a speech, and one of the central points, which he's repeated since then, is that we Ukrainians and Russians are one people. And that's a tone-deaf speech to give in Ukraine in 2014, because a large segment of the Ukrainian population hears, you've just denied my culture, my history, and my language. But Mr. Putin keeps repeating it. Another instance where I think the Russians clearly did not understand Ukraine, again, back in 2014, was after the seizure of Crimea and conflict breaking out in Donbass. You had a situation where in Moscow, they were talking about Novorossiya, this idea that the 7 or 8 oblasts, the provinces of eastern and southern Ukraine would rise up, demand independence from Kyiv, and leaving really a rump Ukraine. And it was pretty clear by April and May of 2020 that wasn't going to happen. But that idea still had attraction in Moscow until the end of 2014. And I worry about this because to the extent that the Kremlin does not have a good understanding of Ukraine, that's a poor basis for their policy decisions. Now, on the other side, what does Ukraine want? I think it's fairly clear. Ukraine wants an end to the conflict. It wants restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over Donbass, and ultimately, Ukraine would like to regain Crimea. Now, having said that, I think Ukrainians, at least those with whom I've spoke, recognize they can't resolve those issues with the military, that going to war against Russia would be a losing proposition. So what you've seen in Kyiv is trying to find other ways to raise the cost to Russia. So, for example, Ukraine's government has treated Crimea and Donbass as occupied territories. And under international law, Russia, as the occupying power, has the responsibility to provide for the areas, and including the economics and including civilian needs. And they've also pressed the West for more sanctions. Now, it's hard to see how Ukraine gets Crimea back. At least in the near term, Ukraine does not have the political, diplomatic, economic, or military leverage. And the only way I see that Crimea comes back is if Ukraine would be hugely successful in economic terms, where a large segment of the Crimean population would say, my economic lot in life, my standard of living will be better as part of Ukraine. I think that, but that requires that Ukraine do a lot in terms of its domestic reform. Now, because that's an analytical decision where judgment where I don't see an easy way to get Crimea back, but that does not mean that Western policy should not continue to not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia and continue the sanctions. And this is something we know how to do. And it's important for the West to make clear to Moscow that what they did in 2014 in Crimea, the biggest land grab in Europe since World War II, is not acceptable. Now, there may be a better chance for Ukraine with regards to restoration of sovereignty over Donbass. As I said, it does not appear that Moscow has the same interest in annexation of Donbass that it had in Crimea. But the problem for Kyiv is that Moscow so far appears content with this idea of a simmering conflict. And Ukraine can't solve the conflict in Donbass on its own. Russia gets a vote, Russia gets a veto. Now, I think that gets them this question of the second challenge, which is, well, Kyiv can't resolve Donbass on its own. It can do more internally. And Ukraine has been a weaker player than it might have been in this struggle with Russia because of bad decisions and slow reforms over the last 30 years. So it's had a weaker economy. That means lower funding for defense. You've seen an outflow of young Ukrainians going to Europe, and I think a frustrated public. On the one hand, I think Ukraine has done much with regards to reform, particularly on the democratic side. It has a history of free and fair elections. One statistic I cite is that since 1991, there have been 6 presidential elections in Ukraine. In 4 of those 6 elections, the incumbent ran for re-election. And in 3 of those 4 elections, the incumbent lost. You don't see that record elsewhere in the post-Soviet space, with the exception of the Baltics. But Ukraine has been hobbled by weak administration, dysfunctional government structure, a fractious parliament. And there hasn't yet been, I think, a decision by the full political elite to really embrace reform, to deal with corruption, to do things that would build Ukraine into a state that realizes its full potential. And there's a cost to this. Look at neighboring Poland. In 1990, gross domestic product per capita in Poland and what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was about equal. Today, GDP per capita in Poland is about 3 times that of Ukraine. And that reflects decisions that the Ukrainian leaderships over 30 years have not made. So they need to find a way to strengthen institutions, a major anti-corruption campaign that treats corruption equally. You go after people that are close to the government parties in the same way that you go after opponents. Curb the influence of the oligarchs, who I think are largely obstacles to a competitive economy because they fear that economy will be bad for their economic interests. And then a real tough problem is going to be reforming the judicial sector, which appears to have many judges who are corrupt and compromised. And the problem for Kyiv is the way the Constitution is set up, it may be hard for the executive branch to do that. But if the Ukrainians could get that critical mass of reforms, first of all, it will be good for the people. Rising living standards are always a good thing, but also it could help Ukraine become a more resilient state, better able to stand up to Russian pressure for what I fear is going to be a long-term struggle with Moscow. Just one last comment. I think the United States and the West can help and should help Ukraine meet these challenges. But Ukraine is going to have to take the lead responsibility and make decisions for itself. So why don't I stop there and happen to listen to Alex's observations and where he agrees and maybe disagrees.
Thank you, Steve. Very much. Excellent presentation. There was so much information there. Thank you so much. And so we'll turn now to Alex, Alex Komorenko, and the floor is yours, Alex.
Thank you very much, Tom. And really, I was inspired by deep and professional analysis made by Ambassador Pfeiffer. It's really my great pleasure to see him because Ambassador Pfeiffer did a great job in Ukraine for strengthening the Ukrainian-American mutual understanding and friendship. And also, I told that I'll be glad to see my Russian colleague Olga, but unfortunately, it's not possible for her because I think that open and correct dialogue are the only ways in attempting to drive anything from the deadlock, especially in such a sensitive area like current Ukrainian-Russian relations. Well, from the point of view of average Ukrainian, neither ultra-nationalist nor direct pro-Russian adept. Definitely, these relations indeed are dramatically deteriorated. They indeed are painful and much sensitive for millions of people from both countries. But, you know, it's not unique in history. Just let me put you in remembrance the relationship between France and Germany in 19 and the first half of 20th century, the relationship of Denmark and Sweden in medieval time, really this list in progress. So right now is such a great black hole between Russia and Ukraine. In my personal case, for instance, 2 years ago, I was not able to attend neither a funeral of my first PhD reviewer, the outstanding Russian historian Stanislav Tutukin, nor to simply put flowers on his grave in Moscow. And as we told, and I absolutely agree with Ambassador Pfeiffer, right now, really the relationship between Kiev and Moscow are on the lowest level since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, the reasons. Let me tell some words about the Ukrainians' consideration of the very beginning of this conflict. I mean the Crimean problem. Stephen was absolutely right, told that whatever president will be in Kiev, right or left, from Lviv or from Kryvyi Rih, just like Zelensky, or from Kharkov, definitely any of them will have no choice but to point out that the deterioration of the relations became a really result of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia's argumentation wasn't still pretty now. Crimea did it by itself on referendum. Right. But what's about the so-called green man or little green man? So what was the first? Definitely not referendum. So Crimea at first was illegally occupied, and only after this the referendum took place. Nobody from international community recognizes. Even Lukashenko, even now, still is hesitating. He understands what it will mean for him personally. What it exactly looks like? Well, to my regret, as a historian, the situation with Crimea became pretty the same to Hitler's Anschluss of Austria in 1938. So at first was occupation, and it was proved, by the way, during the Nuremberg International Trial in 1946, and only after this was a referendum. I agree that the case is not so easy. Definitely, in both cases, the majority of Austrians were indeed pro-German, as well as, let's say the truth, the majority of Crimean population were and still pro-Russian. But what this a reason to undertake the occupation? Undoubtedly no. And first of all, in accordance with the international law and United Nations Charter. So, my dear friends, in this case, again, one of the most important, while controversial trend of 20th and 21st centuries, again, is in progress. self-determination versus territorial integrity. Surely self-determination, no mistake, is one of the most important principles governing the international cooperation, first of all, in the field of human rights. Definitely, this is a right belonging to all people. But, you know, the principle of self-determination does not include as its integral part the right to secession. Only when a state is not acting in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination, when the government unrepresentative in its character, yes, it's possible to raise a question about the secession. And by the way, world community has acknowledged the independence, for instance, of Bangladesh very quickly, because the separation of East Pakistan and the proclamation of the independence of Bangladesh was a result of the discrimination policy towards East Pakistan and the refusal to grant it autonomy. I'm very sorry, but one of the first actions provided by independent Ukraine was the granting of autonomy status to Crimean region or to Crimean Oblast. Since 1991, Crimea became an autonomous republic in Ukraine. That's why the legitimacy of secession might be recognized only when peoples or territories are oppressed as a result of the violation of international law. Was any genocide in Crimea even in the light of 214 Maidan? The answer is no. While, yes, it's possible to speak about the contradictions during this Maidan, it's really known. And definitely, there is no ideal revolution. But again, was there any reason to occupy Crimea? Definitely no. Hope everybody agree with me that it would be, for instance, even ludicrous to think about sanction against France for its stand on Corsican, New Caledonian separatism, against Spain for resistance to a separation of Catalonia, something like this. But in our case, the most important issue, I think, was and still is that while condemning the brutality of the Russian attacks on Chechnya in 1994, hope everybody remembers more or less Samashki and other villages, the international community at the same time didn't encourage or support the Chechens' claim to secede from Russian Federation. And this list also to be continued, the same situation with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, etc. So, what's Ukraine right now is doing in Donbass? Well, I'm absolutely agree with Ambassador Pfeiffer, but let me add something. Despite all of the nuances, Ukraine just tries to regain country's territorial integrity, exactly the same Russia was doing in Chechnya. Yes, for Ukraine, unfortunately, but it was a reality. It was impossible to do this in 214 during the Russian annexation of the Crimea. Thus, Ukraine has no alternative but to strengthen its armed forces, to make deeper and closer its cooperation with our strategic partners, first of all, with the United States, as well as to accelerate its efforts to join NATO. Interesting question, why? Let me also add something, because hope you remember the Budapest Memorandum, because this Budapest Memorandum didn't work. And let me put you in, remember that Ukraine during the signing of this memorandum simply gave up voluntarily the third nuclear armory in the world. And I hope Ambassador Pfeiffer knows about it, that our second president, Leonid Kuchma, just guess few weeks ago, or even few months ago, just remembered that time, well-known, outstanding French President Francois Mitterrand persistently admonished him, "What are you doing? They would betray you." Actually, Mitterrand at that time had nothing to lose. He suffered with the last stage of cancer, but really it was the vice president. That's why, and only one additional remark regarding the US and Great Britain's support of Ukraine. In other words, our partners started to undertake their obligations under the Budapest Memorandum to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine in the event of conflict. And definitely, specialists know that Arleigh destroyer was near the Crimea during the Russian annexation. But one of the best Russian arguments, it was no action. Simply Arleigh just ran away, nothing, never mind. No action was a responsible decision to avoid the Third World War. And today's escalation of the conflict, I absolutely agree with Steve. Really, he made highly professional analysis. My modest point is that this is an operation of a rates rise, I think. Also, plus mutual rallies around the flag. Why? COVID consequences very huge, both in Russia and in Ukraine. Nord Stream 2 certification. Further US-China negotiations concerning Taiwan. Yes, I think it's really will have an influence on the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, because the results of the negotiation regarding Taiwan definitely will be very acute for both sides. And finally, what's to be done? What's to be done? Well, on my point, really the task is to start a real dialogue. But I hope that you remember that former Russian President Medvedev, together with a current Russian President Putin, they persistently argued that, we are ready to speak with Ukraine, we are ready to have negotiations, we are ready to meet with Zelensky, except one. We are not ready to discuss the Crimean problem. Actually, it's definitely impossible for Ukraine. And I agree with Steve, even in case, imagine the fantastic development of the events. Imagine that pro-Russian Medvedchuk will be a president, while it's impossible. Anyway, be sure, Medvedchuk also simply will be not able to recognize the Crimea's annexation. So, to start a real dialogue, but finally Russia should not exclude the Crimean problem from the agenda at least. And in his interesting, while scandal article, Medvedev argues that Russians are patient. Let me add, while it's not my level, that Ukrainians are patient too. Well, and also, I agree with Ambassador Pfeiffer that Crimea is a problem for decades at least. And in one of your interview, you told, and I absolutely agree, that it will be like Baltic republics. Definitely, there is no military solution of Crimean problem. Only economy, as Stephen told, and only let me add one point. Just add in our formula, just what we can do for reunification. Three things, just to work, and again to work. And I agree, only after when Ukrainian living standards and Ukrainian economy will become much better in comparison with Russia, actually the population of Crimea, exactly like the population of Eastern Germany, just will wait for the reunification by their own foods, but not earlier, and definitely not now. The second.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Those excellent remarks. We have a lot of questions piled up. So we're going to move now to questions. I'd like to ask one first here, Steve. You know, there are reports this morning that Belarus has announced joint military drills with Russia on the Ukrainian border, which would seem to be a bit of a shift in Lukashenko's policies. And in that context of sort of upping the pressure on Ukraine, the one theory is that what Putin is doing is trying to force the US toward a summit with Biden. That the Russians have kind of given up on the Europeans now with the new German government likely to be somewhat less sympathetic, that they want to kind of force the dialogue toward Washington. So your views on those 2 points, Belarus and the idea of a summit.
Yeah, no, I think what you've seen in Belarus is, you know, since Mr. Lukashenko's own flawed election, 16 months ago, 15 months ago, he's become increasingly dependent on Russia. And so, you know, you have seen this growing integration between Russian and Belarusian military forces, though I do think it would be a mistake. And, you know, maybe at one level, Lukashenko understands this to actually get involved in a Russian fight against Ukraine. On the summit question, yeah, I think the Russians do want a summit. In a way, I think it's actually something that may help restrain bad Russian behavior, because I can't imagine anything that would more quickly kill the prospect of either a virtual or real summit between President Biden and President Putin, you know, than a Russian military invasion of Ukraine. I mean, that would just freeze that, I think. Now, the Russians, Putin, I mean, some speculate, and I think they may be right, he would like to get back to a Yalta. He would like to have Washington and Moscow make all of these decisions, and then the little powers in Europe simply accept what's decided. That would be a mistake for the US government, and I frankly cannot see the Biden administration playing that sort of role. And I also believe it would be a mistake to push the Germans and the French out. Now, I know there's unhappiness in Ukraine that the Minsk process has not delivered peace in Donbass and has not made the progress they would have hoped, you know, but, you know, it has kept the Germans and the French engaged, and I think in positive ways. And for example, is the basis for European Union sanctions against Russia. So there are reasons where the United States might get more involved, but I would see that more working with the Germans and the French, not trying to displace them. Now, Putin may have a different vision. He may want to have Berlin and Paris out of this, but I think that would be a mistake for the US. And I think that the administration would be careful to avoid that trap.
And how about, we had a question coming in about Putin's suggestion to move this over to the UN, to a P5 leaders summit, take it to a higher level that way. Is that a realistic consideration?
Yeah, I'm not sure by moving this to the P5, you know, how this somehow changes the game board. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to have peace in Donbass, there has to be a fundamental decision to change its policy course in Moscow. And until you get that decision, it doesn't matter whether it's the Minsk, whether it's the Normandy format with Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France, or a US-Russia discussion, or the P5 discussion. You're not going to make progress until there's a readiness in Moscow to try to find peace. And unfortunately, and I think this is not good news for Ukraine, but so far the preference in the Kremlin seems to be to sustain this kind of simmering conflict that we've seen over the past 6 to 7 years in Donbass.
Right. Another question having to do with sort of dialogue here. Should Zelensky ask or acquiesce to talks with Putin, given the pressure of this buildup? I mean, is there any realistic prospect, the questioner asks, for direct Ukraine-Russian discussions?
Well,
To either panelist.
Alex, you may have more details. My impression is that Zelensky's tried to send the message through various channels over the last year that he would like to have a conversation with Putin, but it's been the Russians who have refused to pursue that. But Alex, you may have better information on that.
Yes, Steve, thank you. Just to add something, exactly right. Zelensky for several times openly invited and still invite Putin to have their conversation. But as I told, the usual response of Russia, what would we have as an agenda? And definitely, in case Ukraine, definitely, it's no doubt, would like to discuss the Crimean problem too. No, please, we are not ready to discuss the Crimean problem. It's not a problem for Russia. And actually, one of the questions I just found here regarding the Crimean referendum, Sergei just asked, Ukraine should recognize the referendum. Yes, but in case the referendum really would be undertaken as per the regulation of United Nations documents, because referendum after occupation, it's excuse me, ridiculous. It's out of law, definitely. It's not a civilization. It's a chaos. It's anarchy. Am I right? That's why I think really right now the ball is in Kremlin, because really Putin is not ready to discuss, even to mention the Crimean problem. I think it's the biggest problem and the biggest challenge. Thank you.
Now we have kind of a large question here. One questioner says that the policies toward Ukraine seemed in some way a kind of a proxy policy by the United States, as is the case with Taiwan. In other words, these are issues in a larger geopolitical game vis-a-vis Russia and China. How would you look at that? And also, there are a couple of joint statements coming out now by the Russian and Chinese military leadership, and there was a fear a couple of months ago that there could be simultaneous developments in Taiwan and Ukraine, a certain amount of coordination between Russia and China. So I guess the general issue is this larger proxy aspect of these two conflicts. And Steve, I'll put that one to you.
Yeah, let me say, I don't see what's happening in Ukraine as an American proxy war against Russia. I mean, if you go back to the Obama administration, Barack Obama being president in 2014, when Russia used military force to seize Crimea, they didn't want this. They did not want this at all. I mean, I think in 2014, the Obama administration recognized that the reset had delivered, and I think the reset actually delivered some important things in the New START Treaty, supported Russian policies on Iran and Afghanistan, but it had run its course. They just wanted to have sort of a quiet relationship with Russia. They weren't looking for this. And it goes into a whole host of things. I mean, up until something changed in 2014. Go back and look at how many times from 2010 to 2013 you saw American warships going into the Black Sea. Wasn't very many times, because the demands for the American Navy were in the Persian Gulf and in the Western Pacific. You see now, since 2014, many more visits, and that's part of it, signaling support for allies, but also signaling support for Ukraine. By the same token, there were no NATO military forces deployed in the Baltic states or Poland until 2014. And that changed because of Russian military action against Ukraine and concerns on those states that, Russian ambitions might be more than just Ukraine. So I don't see this as a proxy conflict. This is a conflict that Washington would like to have avoided. But Washington has been pulled into it to some extent, and it goes back to a policy of American support to Ukraine that goes back to the 1990s. So, Alex mentioned the Budapest Memorandum, which I helped negotiate. Now, a couple of important points about the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum, in which the United States, Russia, and Britain agreed to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine, was the memorandum on security assurances, not security guarantees. And that was a key point when we negotiated the language with our Ukrainian and Russian counterparts, because we were very candid in Ukraine saying, if there's a violation by the Russians, this doesn't mean that the 82nd Airborne is coming to fight for you. But we did say what this assurances mean, we're going to take an interest in Ukraine, and if there is a Russian violation, we will do some things. Now, you can debate whether Washington has done enough or not enough, and there'll be different views on that. But this was not something that the Washington was eager to invoke, but it was forced on Washington by a Russian decision to use military force in Crimea, and then to double down with the use of Russian proxy forces, and then in some cases, regular units of the Russian army to prosecute a war in Donbass.
Right. So now one question that just came in notes that the Biden administration has talked about perhaps sending more arms to Ukraine, and you mentioned drawing up a list of sanctions in advance of anything that Russia might do, but the questioner refers to Dr. Komorenko's evocation of, say, Denmark and Sweden and the idea of dialogue to move things forward. Do you think our current policies really are conducive to dialogue?
Well, Tom, actually, I've just mentioned such an examples, but not Denmark with Germany. Denmark with Germany also possible with regard to Schleswig, by the way. But in this case, I only mention that actually the best doctor usually is time. And only I would like to point out that really the huge confrontation, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, maybe within decades, definitely will change. And only the question, how to start, only the question, how to make a first step in such a, definitely long and twisted road to any kind of compromise, any kind of settlement. And as for me, yes, we hope so that sometimes, and by the way, President Biden promised, guess few days ago, that he would like to talk with two Vladimirs, right? With Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky. Probably, maybe some questions he will also ask to both of them. And only this way is possible really to decrease such a confrontation between two nations, two East Slavic peoples. What can I say?
Yes. Now, a question has come in about the importance of Crimea to Russia strategically in terms of its naval presence, and which raises the question, Steve, you mentioned the Novorossiya period around 2014. That whole coastline coming down, toward Odessa, which if Russia occupied just that strip of coastline, it might, secure Crimea. Do you see there's any chance that Russia, wouldn't attack Ukraine, but might seize that coastline? Is that realistic, as people thought it might be in 2014?
Yeah, again, by my logic, I think the costs of a Russian military seizure of that nature would be huge. But again, I'm using the logic, and I'm not prepared to say that Vladimir Putin applies the same logic. Again, it seems to me that the Russian policy over the last 7 years has done nothing but push Ukraine further away and towards the West. But I want to go back to your original point. I mean, in 2014, prior to the Russian military action, remember there was an agreement at that time between Russia and Ukraine that allowed the Russian military to use extensive military facilities in Sevastopol and elsewhere in Crimea. And this was part of the problem that after the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991, when they divided up the Black Sea Fleet, Ukraine only wanted about, I think, 15% of the ships. Russia did not have the facilities in Russian ports on the Black Sea to accommodate those ships. And so Ukraine agreed. Under Yanukovych, the lease was, I think, extended until 2047. So there were still 33 years. Now, after the Maidan revolution, would a new government perhaps have revisited that? We don't know. Maybe they would have. But the Russian interest in having port facilities in Crimea was protected before the Maidan revolution. The Russians did not have to militarily seize Crimea to protect that interest, in the same way that I think the Russian claim of huge oppression of ethnic Russians in Crimea was totally bogus and was made up to justify the military action that they took in February and March of 2014.
Now, we have a couple of questions regarding the referendum on Crimea. As to, I mean, yes, there were little green men involved, but could one say that actually was an accurate reflection of, at least at that moment, the sentiment of the people of Crimea? I mean, what's the view of the referendum at this point?
Alex, why don't you start? I'll have a couple of comments, but you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I told, really a referendum in Crimea definitely was out from the international law. Sergei Guest just argued that, well, it's a good idea to grant the Crimeans with the right just to identify their own. Yes, I agree with this. We just told about such a controversial issue, right? Self-determination and the right of secession, right? But, I just have to point out that everything to be conducted in accordance with the international law. And definitely, green man known, right? And actually, Russia exactly done in Crimea, the scenario done by Hitler in Austria in 1938. And no mistake, because yes, actually, we are not speak about the right of the United Nations just to identify who is able, who is not able for the right of secession, right? Referendum, perfect. So this is not to say that simply California state would like simply to make their local referendum. Okay, bye-bye the US, right now we are free, and etc., 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 etc. Definitely, the point was that in case there were any violations of right of Crimeans, yes, it's possible to open this question, but no violations. In case this is the will of Crimeans, please do this, realize your will, but exactly as per the international, Ukraine, etc., law. Am I right? I guess so. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let me add 3 points to that. First of all, there were no credible observers at the referendum. The OSCE was not there. The UN was not there, and lots of anecdotal reports of Russian media reporters coming in with their Russian passports and being allowed to vote. The second point I would make goes to the very legitimacy of the referendum itself. Crimeans were given two choices in that referendum. Choice number one was, do you want Crimea to join Russia? Choice number two was, do you want Crimea to revert back to its 1994 constitution, which came close to making it an independent state?
Right.
If you lived in Crimea in 2014 and you were happy with Crimea being a part of Ukraine under the existing constitutional arrangement in 2014, you had no box to check. So the referendum was a farce from the beginning. The numbers were very Soviet-like, 97% reported. And I think it was several months later that a member of Mr. Putin's Human Rights Council actually came out and said, no, the turnout was well under 35%. You know, the numbers were totally inflated. So this referendum that took place in Crimea was a total farce.
One question on the corruption issue, as you said, Steve, and also Alexander, that the development of Ukraine economy and rule of law is really key here. It was rather striking to see in the Pandora Papers that Zelensky was the #1 offender among world leaders in basically, I guess we'd say, money laundering or tax evasion. How did that play in Ukraine when because Zelensky had accused his predecessors of exactly the same thing?
Yeah, maybe I should defer to Alex. I mean, the one point, I think there were reports, though, about Zelensky having overseas assets and using some of these shell companies, I think, even back in 2019, before the election. I think this story, so it was a repetition of a story I think that was already out there, but I think Alex should have a better feeling for how it's played in Kyiv.
Well, right now, yes, there are a lot of rumors, especially after the interesting but in some way scandal press conference of Zelensky, where he, how to say better, openly hinted that actually the coup preparation is in progress in Ukraine. And at first, officially, he pointed out the name of the biggest Ukrainian oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov. And really, it's not open, but the beginning of battle between Zelensky and oligarchs. But in this case, for me, more interest the role and place of another one oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, who right now under the investigation in the United States. And that's why the so-called Pandora box is that actually the world-known information about some relevance of Zelensky to the corruption scandals and to offshore companies organized by Kolomoisky really make such a confrontation more acute and more strong. Right now, it's evident in Ukraine because, just up to the beginning of November, actually, all Akhmetov mass media were exactly neutral or even friendly neutral to Zelensky. But since November, after the publication of these documents, really they became openly opposed Zelensky. So what will happen? I don't think it will be the real coup, but I think it's a redistribution of power between Ukrainian oligarchs. Because Ukrainian parliament just adopted in many ways controversial anti-oligarchic law. And due to this law, actually, it's a good idea who will define I am a good oligarch or I am not good oligarch. Who will be such a genius person is just very close to American history. Hope you remember the Senator Hugh Long's idea just to redistribute the money in the United States. Who would do this? Oh, very responsible citizens. Rockefellers, Mellons, Fords, etc., etc., etc. So right now, the question is the role of Kolomoisky. And this is really the point of interest of Ukrainian experts and political science. because I think within a few days it will be more clear. Thank you.
And that just make one observation. This kind of infighting between politicians and oligarchs has been a big reason why, one, Ukraine has not realized the potential that people saw for it back in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And two, it's a big reason why Ukraine is not a stronger, more resilient state, able to resist Russian pressure. In fact, this infighting creates opportunities for the Russians to jump in and put their levers into play internally within Ukraine.
Right, Steve. And let me, 1 second. Some experts openly argued that right now Zelensky became quite close in his policy to earlier Vladimir Putin. He would like to put oligarchs under his control. It's only one additional remark. Thank you. Let's see.
We have one final question. We're coming up to the end of our time here, but a question just came in, whether Ukraine could ever take Russia to the International Court of Justice over Crimea.
Yes, surely, yes. And as far as I know, some, how to say better, some preparational work was and still is in progress. Definitely it will be Ukrainian advertisement, Ukrainian messages to international courts with regard to Crimean illegal occupation. Right, Tom, it's really good question. And definitely, I am not a judge, but really the position of Ukraine indeed is strong, indeed is no mistake, beneficial and historically correct.
Right, but let's be realistic here, is that the International Court of Justice could vote unanimously that Crimea should be returned. That's not going to impact the decision-making in the Kremlin.
I agree.
Where Ukraine may have more success, though, is to the extent that they go after economic actions.
Right.
Where Russia has seized not only Crimea, but it's actually seized significant economic assets from Ukraine.
Exactly.
And then Russian state assets outside of Russia might be vulnerable to attachment and such if there was an ICJ ruling.
Exactly.
Concrete...
says work, and work, right?
There you go. Now, last question in terms of work. Are there any immediate steps one could imagine to build trust in this relationship? I mean, just in terms of confidence building measures, I mean, small steps, short of a summit. That's the last question.
Russia might start withdrawing some of the troops it's deployed on Ukraine's borders. That could be an early first step.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can go first. So, well, gentlemen, it's been a fantastic discussion. Really, so much excellent information and insight. I cannot thank you enough. And Steve, Alex, thank you once again. And I'll turn things over now to Todd Lefkoe.
Thank you for that excellent conversation. When you listen to a conversation like this, you start to realize the impact that while supply chains for goods are breaking down, supply chains and relationships between countries are growing. No nation acts by itself. And it has implications in terms of potential escalation or relationships far beyond the border, and always the fear of escalation beyond what original intents were. You know, we start to see a difference in interests between, in terms of questions, you know, the question of how to do a pumpkin pie and answering that, as opposed to the difference of how do you solve international problems of conflict, are totally different levels. And yet the point which is made over and over again is this conflict, the concept that discussion has to start somewhere, because you can't resolve something unless you can try to jointly define the issue and try and make it so that issues become just within different nations. I'd like to thank both our panelists, Tom Hansen, Alexander Komorenko, and the Honorable Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, and also to thank you to Sergei Kuznetsov, our technical genius who put all this together. And I'd like to thank all of you who came in to participate today. I'd like to remind you that our next program will be this Thursday, December 2nd. We're doing one with Macalester College on Why do I miss the Soviet Union? Which is an interesting question, and which people would define in different ways, but that's at 1 o'clock, and you can check our website at www.ribcc.org. And I'd like to thank our co-sponsors again, the Committee on Foreign Relations, Zerkalo, the Museum of Russian Art, and Global Minnesota. So for that, thank you for watching. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you soon, and have a good holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to see you. Bye.
It was good to see you, Alex. And Stephen,
Thank you.
thank you. Enjoy the suffering in California as you're sitting there in the warm weather, and while
No,
the rest of us are not.
I hesitate to tell you, but our predicted high day is 76 degrees.
Was that in
A
Minnesota?
typical late November day.
We asked in Minnesota, was that above or below zero? Listen, thank you. Good job, Thomas.
Thank
As
you.
always.
Yeah, and Steve,
Tom,
thanks.
take
That was
care.
outstanding. Alex, you guys.
My highest
was great.
consideration to all of you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Happy holidays, everybody.
Hey, fuck off.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Пока, пока.